some of this we've covered, yeah, but typically just for folks here, I know that there have been presentations on which are the sectors where people are investing in and what type of valuations are people investing in. As someone who's been in this for 8 years, I can tell you that all kinds of companies get all kinds of investments at different points of time. So one thing that we know very well as investors is that ultimately businesses get built because you're passionate about a problem and you're solving it. Sometimes there will be times when the problem is fashionable and sometimes the problem will not be fashionable. And that's perfectly okay, but you will just continue to move along and build businesses. So we spend our time in 3 sectors: technology, consumer, healthcare. In technology, it's internet, mobile, of course, payments get spoken about a lot, infrastructure gets spoken about a lot. We do invest in brands, a company which we invested in, for example, some of you will be familiar with this Paperboat. So that's an investment that we had made a couple of years back. And in healthcare, of course, we invest in pharma, we invest in service providers, a whole host of companies. For those of you in Bombay, we're investors in Suburban Diagnostics, a healthcare services company. So there are all kinds of investments we make, but largely we stick to the 3 sectors. This is our team. So you will, in most interactions with our firm, you should get to meet a very large proportion of our team. 3-4 folks you probably will meet, and you probably will get to meet almost the entire team at least once as you make your journey in choosing the right partner. And the 2 things that we speak about, at least when we speak to entrepreneurs like yourself, for Sequoia in India, over the last 8 years, there's one thing that we've learned is that young companies in the early stage, can appreciate help of variety of sorts. So we have assembled a pretty big team of almost 18 people. Think of themselves as people who really work with our portfolio on multiple things. Whether it's marketing, whether it's recruiting, whether it is technology, variety of choices, and that's what we do. So the focus of today is on, I think the most difficult one, because compared to valuations, it's a lot more sexy and exciting. This is the more boring and sometimes painful, and very often people don't really enjoy this. But I will anyway take a shot. So I kept trying to keep it really simple. I don't have too many slides. So the idea would be to wrap this up in like 30 minutes and then maybe get questions from you. So I almost look at any term sheet discussion in 3 parts. I think the first is getting to the term sheet. The second is the term sheet itself, and what I have done is I've highlighted 3 things, and then which we talk about most, and then there is a detailed term sheet which I will, I'm happy to run a sample, as you guys think about it. And third is, finally questions beyond the term sheet, which is I was also asked to speak a little bit on documentation, which is, what is it that happens after the term sheet is over. So why is getting to term sheet, important? Look, I think one thing why it's important for you, and the most important thing for an entrepreneur to know is whether the term sheet is a serious term sheet, or whether it is something that is being offered, to you by an investor who comes in the morning simply because he wants to do more work. And I'm sure some of you have had the experience, and it's a pretty unpleasant experience to get a non-serious term sheet. So how do you know that? How do you know if it's a non-serious term sheet?
I have a very basic question.
Yes.
I'm a new entrepreneur, and I don't know what
to understand what the hell I'm passionate about and what the hell I'm trying to do. So that's one thing for you to test. The second is, may not be very relevant if you're very early, but will be relevant even if you're a mid-sized company. Because people have questions on a good investor, a serious investor will ask you, what is attraction? Now, the nature of the traction can be financial, it can be metrics, depending upon how early the company is. But a good serious investor will ask you those questions. If it is, users, it is stickiness, it is cohorts, how they are trending over a period of time. A serious investor will ask you these questions. If he doesn't ask you, that means he's, kind of trying to wing it on the side. A good investor is serious about product, because we all know that the only thing finally a company lives and dies by is product, and how the product is perceived by the customer and how the product is experienced by the customer. So a good investor will have some sense of what you're doing, will not show up in your meeting without having ever seen the product. Will hopefully, if it's a website, if it's an app, would have hopefully downloaded it, played with it. He may have some interesting perspective. He or she may have interesting perspectives of the product. I think that's a good sign for you to know if this person is serious or not. There are a bunch of things that you will discover along the journey, because from an investor perspective, one of the things that they are trying to calibrate is dependability. Are you dependable? And dependability is, when you say something, do you mean it? When you say something, is it normally true? Or is it something that's completely a figment of imagination? And that's serious. And therefore, these conversations with your meeting investors is pretty serious. One thing you can be sure of is smart investors are making notes of what you're saying, and they are going to go and find out if it's true. Because that's the only way they can get a sense of dependability. And of course, there is the terms, which we will talk about in much more detail. I think valuation is something that has already been discussed with you guys in the previous session, but we can talk more about what are the terms that are there. So this is getting to the term sheet. And if an investor who's talking to you looks like he's knowledgeable about the market, is genuinely interested in the product, has done some customer feedback, is asking you the right questions on the kind of traction that you're beginning to see, then you probably know that the term sheet you're getting is a serious term sheet. And therefore, it's worth spending time on, because term sheets can be complicated to understand the first time around. So it's important that you spend time. So this is a getting to the term sheet, part of the story. So what is there in a term sheet? So I'm going to first talk about the critical things, and then I have a gory Word document that gives you a sample term sheet. So we will talk about both, so that you guys get a sense of both. So first, I think on valuation terms. So what you would like the term sheet to clearly say is the investor is investing so much money, and this is the amount of ownership that the investor is seeking in the firm. And this is the first basic thing which will be laid out in the term sheet. So you're saying, look, am I raising 10 crores, 20 crores, 50 crores, or 3 million, 4 million for 25, 30, 40% of the company? So this is the first question you're asking. That should be laid out in a very simple way in the term sheet. The second thing is you want to know when the money is coming in. Is it coming in as soon as we close, or are there any conditions attached to it? So this is also something that becomes clear in the term sheet. Is it coming immediately? Is it coming in parts? Some coming now, some coming after 6 months? Is it coming based on any milestone, or is it coming unconditionally? Very important terms for you to get a sense of. And you should read it very carefully to make sure that if your expectation is that this money is coming in now, this money is coming in full, this money is coming in its entirety with no conditions attached, you need to know that. And that should show up in the term sheet and should be written like that. Most term sheets will also ask for an ESOP pool if you already don't have one, because it's well understood that as you're building a large company from scratch, you are going to need a lot of partners, a lot of professionals, other founders. So it will be important for the investor to know, like, are you creating a pool of equity for future employees, for big hires you want to make? Because that's reality, and you know that, and everyone knows that. So have you created an ESOP pool? If you don't have an ESOP pool for potential employees, the term sheet will typically have one. That's on valuation, and look, there will be a detailed Word document, so I'll go through that. But the second thing you should see in term sheet is what I would loosely call as exit rights, which is an investor is investing in your firm. There will be certain expectations around how will that person or how will that investor get eventual liquidity, will eventually be able to sell the firm. In some very simple, sell his shares actually. He's not selling the company. He doesn't own the company. But what is it that the investor is demanding in terms of exit rights? What are the things there to worry about or things to watch out for? Number of years, number one. Nature of exit, which is, is there an expectation that it will happen in 3 years, 5 years, 7 years? Is there an expectation of how it will happen, which is, going to the public markets, or potentially the entrepreneur choosing to sell the firm? And there is something called liquidation preference, which you will see in most term sheets. How many of you understand liquidation preference? Okay, good. Then it's worth explaining. So what liquidation preference says is very simple. All it says is, as an investor, so the way it works is the following. I have come in as an entrepreneur and I started a company. Therefore, I own 100% of the company. Normally, we put very little money to get started. Right? Investor is typically the first person who is putting in a reasonable amount of capital into the company. Now, it could be an angel investor. It could be a bigger, larger investor. One of the things that we will see in most documents is something called liquidation preference. All liquidation preference says is, when we sell this company, if for whatever reason, I'll give you an example. Let's say I'm investing, for simplicity, 3 million for 33%. right? Which means I'm valuing the company at $10 million. Okay? All liquidation preference says is in the eventuality that this company will be sold for less than 10 million, 7 million, 5 million, 8 million, I will obviously not make any return because I own only 33% and therefore 7 to 33 is 2.1 million. I won't make any return, but the capital that is invested is protected. This is called liquidation preference. For first time when you sign up for it, it feels like, oh my god, the investor is showing up, he's investing X amount of money. Why should there be a preference? Why should the investor get his capital back? So, what we sell on the products, and look, this is not just us, it's like convention, this is how it has got done and built over a period of time. The view is there's almost a first in, first out principle, last in, first out principle as far as capital is concerned, equity capital is concerned. So what you say is the last person who comes in, because everyone is coming in at different prices, right? As an entrepreneur, you own 100% for zero, effectively, because you're not, you may put 10 lakhs, but basically you're putting in very little money. So the value at which you come in is basically zero. Investor 1 may come in at 10 million. Investor 2 may come in at 20 million. Investor 3 may come in at 100 million. One of the things that we follow in investing is that there is a last in, first out principle, which means for whatever reason, if the company gets valued at a price whereas the last investor who came in doesn't make any return, he first gets his capital back. You know, and so on and so on and so on. So we work with some numbers, but conceptually that's what it is. So you will see something called liquidation preference in almost any term sheet that you sign, especially the first ones.
So what does it imply? Does it mean that let's say the company gets sold at 3.8 million?
So you will basically, the investor, if he's invested 3 million, will take 3 million out. That's all it means. And the remaining 5 million is basically what you will have. So for whatever reason, if it gets sold for 8 million, he will take only 3 million because that's what, he doesn't get any return, he gets only the capital back.
If the company sells for less than 3 million?
Then, it's a great question. If it sells for 2.5 million, effectively what liquidation preference means is that the entire 2.5 million goes to the investor. That's what it means. Okay. But there's a practical element to it which we can talk about. The term sheet is term sheet, legal documentation. But that's what happens. In US, that's exactly what happens. So in the US, in Singapore, that's exactly what happens. The liquidation preference is treated very seriously by all the courts. You know, in here it's a little different.
Here what happens?
It's not enforceable.
As you know, it's enforceable. It's not an enforceability issue at all. It's not a legal question at all. It's just that in India, you know this, you're dealing with lots of suppliers, you realize that everything gets negotiated. So you may have whatever legal document you want in life, but because it takes 10 years in a civil process, everything can get, so theoretically everything gets negotiated. Which is both bad and good, you know, for you, and you see that, you know, dealing with suppliers, and therefore there's a little bit of nervousness around any term, forget like this. Which is why, unfortunately, on the flip side, you will see that some of the terms in India, at least on the investor terms, are often someone in the US may look at it and say, my God, this is very draconian. This is very unreasonable. Why is it there? Half the reason it's there is because we're not sure whether a software term will actually get executed. So that's also the flip side of it, but yeah.
So some term sheets have like 1.5x, 2x liquidation preferences also. What is a fair number? I mean, because if it's 2x liquidation preferences, it means that really you have to kind of, if you exit, and if you don't do it, most chances are that you will not make any money at all.
So what is fair? Look, I think it's a little bit of, it is a function of how much risk you believe and often what the investor believes in the time of investing. Because a 2x link pref ask means the investor is genuinely worried about risk is more. There are two reasons why people will ask for a 2x link pref. Either the risk is a lot or the valuation is too high at the time of entry. Because this is another way of effectively saying, let's say I've invested 10 million at 100 million valuation, I'm asking for a 2x link pref. What it basically means is I'm really nervous about 100 million. Okay, so it's not, so there's no unfairness or fairness in it. Because you will ask, let's say, as an entrepreneur or as any other investor, let's say I'm sitting there on the other side of the table with you negotiating with a third investor. Obviously there's a desire to maximize valuation. Liquidation preference is a way to bridge that gap effectively. And the reason for that is simple, right? What you're basically saying is, if someone has signed in for 10 million for 100 million and is asking for a 2x link pref, The reason he's asking is he's very nervous on whether you will make, whether this company will be worth, more than 100 million. But what you are saying is, I'm willing to give you the liquidation preference because I am very confident that this valuation, while you think is high, is actually not that high, and eventually you will make a lot more money because you're taking less dilution. So for 10 million, if the person you're giving 100, at 100 million, you're giving 10% dilution. What he's signaling by asking for a 2x late pref is saying that the valuation is too high. What you are saying by accepting a 2x late pref is saying, I am confident this company will be worth 200 million, therefore I'm okay with you only having 10% and not 20%. So there's no fair number here. It can be one. Typically, you will see at least one, but he's right. Sometimes you will see 1.5, sometimes you will see 2, and the context is always price. It's not so much. There's no benchmark.
So typically you said that capital comes later on, gets a preference, or the valuation keeps on increasing. Let's assume for whatever reason, Series C happens at a valuation which is lesser than Series B, for whatever reason. It does happen many a time. So in a situation like that, does the Series C guy still get a liquidation preference, or a Series B guy would have a liquidation preference?
Yeah. So what will happen is, and I've not put that term actually, I should have. No, I have actually put it. So that is called anti-dilution. Okay, so first let me explain this and then that will become very clear. So what happens is, in addition to exit rights, the other rights that normally a minority investor, these are all minority investor rights. So it's as relevant for investors and as relevant sometimes for you, especially if that business that you're in requires a lot of capital and you expect yourself to get a dilution. So I'll talk about the minority rights. I have a very interesting entrepreneur. We have a company which is the NBFC, and I know the entrepreneur negotiated minority rights from day one because he said, look, I know today I have 50%, but this is an NBFC, which means we're going to raise capital many, many times, which means to become a large company, I may eventually own only 10%, and therefore I need to be protected. So these are minority rights. Minority rights, typically there are 4 or 5 rights. Key is board representation, which is okay. You obviously want a board and you want the investor to be represented in the board. No investor will ask for a majority board representation, so I'm asking a majority board, that means something is fishy. Normally it will be like, let's say, board of 3, board of 5, you have the right to nominate a majority, and the investor may have 1 or 2 representatives depending upon the context. Key man protection is something that most investors will insist on because they want you to be focused only on this business. So key man clause will typically say you should devote all your time and energy in this business. So it's kind of obvious, but that is something that you will see. Then there are 3 rights which I'd like to talk about, which are probably most relevant for you. The first is, let's start with anti-dilution since you raised the question. One of the rights any investor will ask, again in the spirit of last in first out principle, is they will say, if a round were to happen at a lower price, my price will get reset to the lower price. So what it means is, if someone comes in at say 10 million at 100 million, another guy comes in 10 million at 200 million, and a third guy comes in 10 million at 150 million, the guy who came in at 10 million at 200 million asked for his price of 200 million to be reset to 150. Now why does he ask for this right? The reason he asks for this right is, one of the rights which all investors will ask, affirmative rights, is a right to block any future raising of capital. Right? Because obviously, any fresh equity, fresh debt, all the investors who are there will ask for the right. The reason they ask for anti-dilution is if at that point of time, capital needs to be raised at a price lower than the price at which they came in, they don't want to have the fiduciary responsibility to block it. Because theoretically, they should block it. Right? I'm saying, practically, obviously there's a reason why the company needs the capital, and there's a reason why money needs to be raised at a lower price. Anti-dilution is to make sure that you and the investor are not on the opposite sides of the table when the company desperately needs the capital, and everyone has to be willing to raise the capital at whatever price is available. Now, therefore, when that happens, the price gets reset. Therefore, effectively, then all the liquidation preference of the Series B and the Series C are pari passu or equal. Because if the 200 guys are reset to 150, at 150 all the rights exist, right? Liquidation preference exists, and therefore there is. So that's the way it kind of works out in case of a future round which happens in the workers.
And also, does the guy who has come in Series B get extra equity because the Series C is now getting the rundown?
Yes, that's how the anti-dilution works. The anti-dilution basically, if you're resetting, it means if I had 10 million for 200 and the new round is happening 10 million for 150, effectively you're getting more shares to come. Basically, you're saying you're getting more shares to make sure that you don't block the new round. So that's something called anti-dilution. Now, there are variants of anti-dilution, but this is in spirit. This is what anti-dilution is, exactly to protect the order in which capital came in. There's one more right, and affirmative rights. Affirmative rights is an easy one. We'll talk about that in detail. Affirmative rights are typically rights around as you're building the business. If there is a super critical business decision, there is an expectation as a minority partner that you will ask and seek counsel before you take the call. Okay, so budgets which you make, big capital investments that you do, changes in business model if that's what you're intending to do. There are obviously many key decisions, big business decisions. So a good investor will ask for affirmative rights on business decisions that are material, right? If you're seeing a list of affirmative rights on everything, small operational elements, and again, you're probably seeing an investor who is having a slightly different mindset from someone who's saying, look, at the big key decisions, I want to be heard. And that's called affirmative rights, and we'll talk about some specifics there. And then there's one other right which you will see, and which may be familiar with, something called a tag-along right and a drag-along right. And I think that's important for you to know. Tag-along is very simple. It just means that if you sell shares, I can sell shares pro rata basis, which basically means, let's say you own 75% of the company after the investment, and let's say the new investor owns 25%. Tag-along says if you sell 5% of your shares, investor has a right to sell 5% of the shares. So that's what tag-along is. It's very conventional, very acceptable. Drag-along has two types of rights. One which typically says that if for whatever reason you're selling 51% of your shares, because you own 75 and you're selling 51% of your shares, then most investors will ask for the right to sell all their shares. Because most investors are backing you in the company. And if you've decided to sell, it's normally conventional practice to give the investor the right to sell all their shares. That's called full tag, occasionally, sometimes a drag. And finally, what you will see is a drag-along right. A drag-along right is the right to drag your shares, even though the investor owns 25-30%. It's a right to drag your shares for making an eventual sale happen. If for whatever reason, let's say it's taken 6 years or 7 years of investing, and there is no way for the company to go public. And if the investor, most investors, have a fund life, some of them 8 years, 10 years, 12 years. So based on their fund life, they will say, look, if for whatever reason, if after 6 years or 5 years, you're not able to sell, we're not able to do anything, I don't get any liquidity, then I will have the right to drag your shares for an eventual sale. The reason is so that if at that time there's an offer made by an independent party, you have the opportunity as an investor to get liquid. It's a very important right. So think very carefully about most term sheets in the early stage will ask for it. Obviously, what you will see is as you become a larger and larger company and as you raise more and more capital, this right will normally go away, right? But early on, this is the right that is asked, so be very thoughtful about the number of years you're signing up for, when does the drag get activated, and I think that's it's a very important right. Because the reason it's important right is tomorrow you don't want a hard burn, right? I'm saying, let's say you signed up for a drag at the end of 3 years, which is too early in my view. Look, at the end of 3 years, there's a possibility that there's someone else who shows up and says, I want to buy the company, and your shares are dragged along. And you may feel pretty terrible about it. So that's be very thoughtful about signing up for drag. But early stage, there will be an expectation. So it's about timelines and how much time you can negotiate.
What about if B round comes and like drag along and or C round comes? Do you still have right to drag them also? Or
So what you will see, yes, that's what happens. Eventually what happens is a good practice, and this is just good practice recommendation. Whenever you do a new round, insist on all investors signing one shareholders agreement, okay? Because you must make the rights consistent with all shareholders. Now you can have rules. You can say these rights are for those who have more than 10%, these are rights for those who have more than 5%, and these are rights, there are no rights for the people with less than 5%. You can create whatever rules you want, but the good practice is to make sure that all the investors sign up for one shareholders agreement. So in that agreement, it will specify whether the investors have the right to mutually drag each other or not. Right? Normally what you will see is investors will not agree to, they will agree to a drag if, let's say, sometimes a majority of the investors. So the way it will work is, let's say there are 3 investors on the table. If a majority of the investors decide to then drag them, you can exercise a drag on another person's share. So that's the way it typically gets negotiated between the investor or the others. Sometimes, I have seen term sheets where investors have the right only to drag the entrepreneur's shares and not the shares of other investors. I don't think it's a good thing or a bad thing. It just puts you in an advantageous position when you have to negotiate an eventual sale. Because you know that if the other two investors are not interested in selling, the drag will not get enforced.
So does this mean that as an entrepreneur you have the right to actually opt out of this drag?
No. Early stages, no. Early stages is hard. But as you become a bigger company, can you say I will not get dragged? Depends on the season, as they say.
What does it actually mean? Because it's a bit confusing. Can you expand a bit on this drag?
No, it's right. I'll give you examples. I can give you a very interesting example, which is the investment of Actis in MTR Foods, where they actually exercised drag. So there is an example of the drag right here. So drag says that, normally this is how a drag right will be phrased. It will say if a company will try to provide an exit to the investor within 5 years of investing through, it will start by saying, in taking the company public. If it fails, it will say, the company will try on best efforts basis to find another investor who can basically buy these shares of the existing investor. If that fails, it will say, if those two options have failed, and let's say 6 years have passed, then it will say that the investor has the right to drag the entrepreneur's shares for a full sale of the company to a third party.
No, but what if the existing investor is asking for too high a price? Basically, then that will never happen. Which means you'll essentially be forced to sell all your shares. Is that what it means?
No. See, because you still have to find a third party, right? So there has to be a price. Oh, actually, no, this is not to protect that case. Let's say an existing investor.
No, basically, it's just that if you can't find a buyer for your shares, so, but is there a price that's defined or is it just?
No, the price is not defined. The price is not defined. See, it does, it's a fair point. It does mean, for example, if for whatever reason the investor believes that, but see, you have the option of taking the company public.
I want 200x, and that may or may not be fair, right? So
No, but the 200x has to be offered by a third party investor, right? Let's say a third company, or a third, let's say I'm a company, and let's say you're an entrepreneur and he's an investor, right? The drag gets activated only when there's a real price. So the investor, he may have any expectation, but for the drag to happen, there has to be a buyer on this side, right, at a price. Otherwise, the drag cannot happen, because for the drag to get exercised, there has to be a buyer at this price.
Suppose there are two buyers. One is interested in buying only the investor's portion at say 10x, and then there is another buyer who is interested in buying out the entire company at 12x for the investor. So there, the investor can choose to drag.
Absolutely, the investor can choose to drag and basically make the sale happen. That's what basically he will do.
Which clause is have difficulty for next round of development? You should be careful when you're signing, especially next round. It can be very specific, like next round. Or
No, that's fair. I mean, which are the kind of clauses that are difficult for subsequent rounds?
B round is if you have.
I think if you've signed up for an exit clause for a very short time period in the previous round, then the other round can be difficult. Because we have seen that in some situations. Let's say we are doing a Series B. A Series A has been done by an investor. There is an exit clause which has given him 3 years. And then let's say after 2 years, you're basically getting another investor in. The other investor is saying, oh, you know what, I want to invest, but this your other investor, he's saying I can exit in 1 year. So in such, no, it's not a bad thing, but you must remember then that there will be a negotiation where the new investor will demand from the old investor that please extend your exit timeline. So he will say the exit clock starts now for 3 more years. Because I don't want to be in a situation where I've invested in this company, it's only 1 year, and you want to sell the company. So there will be expectations. So that's an example of a clause which will get negotiated when a new investor comes in. And if you've given a very aggressive exit clause, then that can create a situation. If you're given any kind of IRR guarantee, we'll talk about that. Exit like 1.5x Lakepref is clean, right? Sometimes some investors, usually for valuation reasons, may say, okay, you know what, I sign up for 100 million, but I need to make sure I make at least 20% IRR. Okay, which means compounded 20% IRR I need to make. So that's another example, which will get, the new investor coming in may have either wrong expectation because you say, man, this guy signed up for 20% IRR. Maybe I can also get 20% IRR. Either that, or you will say, oh my God, how will he fulfill this obligation? Does it have any implication on you?
You said
But
they will sign the in fresh clause?
Yeah, you have to insist. So at that time, I'm saying you can negotiate. I'm saying if you have an IRR clause in your Series A, which you should absolutely not sign up for, would be my recommendation. But if you have for whatever reason, in Series B, it will get negotiated. So be thoughtful about it.
One question. Where you were saying that the minimum IRR practically denotes you're signing up like a debt instrument, basically. But those kind of kind of not a debt side. You sign up for a minimum IRR because business conditions can change, right?
Yeah, so do people sign up for minimum IRR? The answer is yes, they do. People sign up because look, at the end of the day, the way it is not like debt is because it is effectively linked to exit. And it's not linked to a cash payment, right? It's not like you're linking a cash. Effectively, what you're signing up for is a IRR. If you think about it, what the entrepreneur is basically signing up is, when does no IRR get asked? It gets asked when the valuation is crazy. Let's say valuation is high. That's when you ask for no IRR. What the entrepreneur is saying, you know what? I want this money at 100 million valuation. I think this business will easily compound at 20% a year. If it doesn't, for whatever reason, I have extra shares, right? I own 90% or 80%. I'll sell some shares and give them the IRR. But effectively, what you've got is you've got someone with equity capital at IRR. It's another way of thinking about it.
You're being an equity investor.
It's not a great thing. Personally, I would say it's a little of look. We have our own experiences, and it's something. You're right. As an equity investor, you want to participate in the full upside. If you're talking IRR, that means you're nervous about the price. Therefore, the right answer, and that's what I would recommend to a team member of mine, a colleague at Sequoia, is to say, please go and say you're uncomfortable at this price, and just ask, have a conversation on what price will you do, without an IRR. See, I personally am not a big fan, and that's personal opinion, of anything that investment bankers, and I'm sure there's some of you, I know there any investment bankers in this room, but they will often offer solutions to bridge valuation expectations. You will have an expectation of, let's say, 100 million or 50 million, and let's say the equity investor is sitting at 30 million. These are guises which they come up with to help you bridge the expectation. That's what I call it, right? IRR guarantees, liquidation preference, valuation linked to performance. All these are methods to bridge a gap. My personal humble advice, suggestion I have to both colleagues at Sequoia who are in situations like this, or to yourself is, bridge it then. Don't wait for events to pan out to bridge. It's always a bad idea. But look, people have different views of life, and therefore everyone is entitled. My personal view is always, if you have a problem of bridging, settle today. You're at 30, the other guy is at 40, either figure out whether you should be at 30 or 35, close it. Don't link too many of these things to this, because all these things potentially, as I call it, potentially put you on the opposite side of the table. And good partnership with investors is where in most situations you're on the same side of the table. That's when it's a good partnership. So you don't want things linked to performance, because you don't want a situation where investors are unhappy with your performance. That's what I keep saying. So you don't want to guarantees, ideal. But look, once in a while you will experiment with some of these things. And investors will experiment with some of these.
Are there any rights to deny the participant dilution for the investment you are making now? Because you take 20% at Series A, at B somebody at 25% comes in. You are also getting diluted.
Yes.
So either you can choose to make a follow-on investment or kind of, but is there any clause which says that you get diluted at twice at what I'm getting diluted at? The investor.
Or when investor gets diluted twice, you can. Investor gets diluted more. So no, it doesn't work like that. What you normally will see, is you can ask for an ESOP pool to be created at that time, which allocates some shares to you as an entrepreneur, which effectively compensates you for the amount that you're getting diluted. Those mechanisms exist and they are done. So there are two parts. One is pro rata, which is most investors will keep the right to invest at least as much as they own on a share basis, so that they can keep their ownership. But your point is a very important point, and I think it comes to the valuation point, and which is one of the things which a good Series A investor will be worried about at all points of time, especially if you've raised money before, or even a Series B investor, especially if you've raised money before, is how much ownership does an entrepreneur have? Okay, that's a very important thing. It's very important because a good investor will want entrepreneurs to have a material ownership in a company. Okay, if the new investor, for whatever reason, but there's history, right? I'm saying 4 founders, 25% each. You start the business, 2 of the founders go away at some point of time. sell it to different people. So there's always history. So ideally, that's what we want. We want to see the entrepreneur or majority and get started. That keeps life very simple. But if for whatever reason the entrepreneur owns very little due to history, then what you said is right. You will ask for some ways by which the existing investors get diluted a bit more than what you're getting diluted. I have personally a situation right now where we have done that. We have created a system where there's a 10% dilution of the company or a 20% dilution of the company, and we're doing it in a way where there's an existing entrepreneur who's driving it who owns 15%, and we have said we will make him dilution agnostic, which means he doesn't get diluted at all. So absolutely, there are people, that's the number one thing which, as an investor you're worried about. Is there enough ownership here in the company for the entrepreneur? So a good investor is always on your side because he's thinking like that. Because he knows everything else is, is fine.
I just wanted to know that either of these clauses will be there, right? It's not necessarily all these clauses are there.
Which clauses you have in mind?
The governance clauses.
All of them will be there.
All will be.
Yeah, because there'll be board representation. You'll ask for a tag, which is if you sell, I sell pro rata. There will be a drag because at the time of exit, if I can't get an exit, I will have the investor will have the right to drag your shares. There will be key man exclusivity. There will be dilution protection, basically saying future rounds happen, I have as an investor has a right to keep his shareholding. So if I've invested, the investor has invested 20%, I have the right for 20% the subsequent round to preserve my ownership. Anti-dilution, protecting you from raising capital or the company raising capital at a lower price, and a bunch of rights which I will call affirmative rights, which is basically around mostly minority protection, but most of them are like that. I'll talk about those.
But these are negotiable.
I would say it's hard. See, these are minority protections, right? I'm saying it's very hard to negotiate your way out of it. Like you may get like tag, drag. It's very hard because these are basically to say, look, as an investor who does not have control. What is because look, these are all getting triggered at various points of time. Like a drag is getting triggered if exit happens after 5 years or 6 years, or does not happen within 5, 6 years. So you're protecting for the investor. So I've not seen any of these rights getting negotiated away. I think it's important for you to be aware of these rights because many times it may come as a surprise the first time you see a transaction. So that's typically what it is. A drag may go away if it's a very large company. Because let's say you're a 500 crore company raising 100 crores. A drag will go away because the purpose of the drag is to say what happened, what if there is no way to get liquidity. If you're a 500 crore company, public market jayega, something will happen, so you don't have to worry. So drag goes away to protect when the exit risk goes away, is the way I would describe. Because what you don't want to be is in a situation where there's no exit and you're stuck. Because most of the funds who invest have an 8, 10, 12 year life, which means we have an obligation to return the capital in some form or shape to our investors. Whatever the capital is. Basically, the limited partners who invest in us basically say, look, at the end of 10 years, I want the money. It doesn't matter whether it's 1 cent, or if it's 90% of the money or 2x the money. But I don't want to have continuing investments in a company after the fund life is over.
So just to understand the drag again, you have 20% and the drag has 80%. After 6 years, if there is no exit or possibility of an exit, you have an option to take his 80% along with your 20% if you find a buyer.
Yes. That is exactly that is the essence of it. So normally it goes away for companies at scale, where you know that there is no risk of the company not being in a position.
Typically, when something goes really south, it has to go at any cost, and that 80% should not be able to lock in 80%.
Exactly.
Are you saying the subsequent round of funding tends to work and if you do well?
Yeah, I would say the drag will go away when the company reaches a certain scale and size, when there is no risk of, because the drag exists to avoid, for the investor side, is to say, I don't want to be caught in an illiquid situation forever.
It's basically investor trying to protect his exit.
Yeah, because you have obligations to your investors, saying that, after 10, 12 years, whatever it is, I'll return something to you. I will not give you shares in the company, because you can't.
And who decides the pricing in a drag?
The party which is coming and offering the price, right? So a drag gets operated only when a third party shows up. So
potentially the investor could undersell without any recourse to the promoter.
Without any recourse to the promoter. Yes, but conceptually, the reason why the investor is doing it is basically because he needs liquidity, right? So it makes no sense to sell it under close. And if you believe for whatever reason that it's undervalued, then you will be able to find another person who will come and give it full value.
The promoter can buy it back.
I'm saying you can buy up. Many things can happen. If you believe it's undervalued, you can buy it back. You can get another investor to come in. So
initially you mentioned regarding liquidation preference. You mentioned a minimum number of 3 million, that's the capital. And let us say, in the worst case scenario, you are able to sell a company at 2 million. The market conditions will change in 5 million. So in that case, the 1 million is the liability of the promoter to give it to
no, that's not. I think basically it's clean. So that means basically the 1 million is lost by the investor and the investor is taking liquidation. That's all. There's no personal obligation. So this is not, there's no personal obligation.
Could you explain all the difference between straight deal and structured deal?
So straight is what I said, which is let's say you invest 3-4 million for 25% ownership. That's a clean straight deal. The amount of capital you know is this is the ownership that the investor is asking for. It's a straight deal. A structured deal where you say, you know what, I'm investing 3 million. I may have a ownership from 20 to 30% depending on. Now the depending on can be financial performance, the depending on can be exit, the depending on can be anything. So that's a structured. So anything where there is, you cannot say today what the ownership is a structured deal. A tranche deal is something where the money comes in different sequence. So the money can, money says X amount will come now, Y amount will come after 1. So or 6 months or 3 months, whatever the case. That's a tranche deal. So you will see structure and tranche, the two words that you will hear from an advisor.
Milestones, tranching depends on milestones.
Could be. So tranching can be performance linked, tranching can be unambiguous. There are tranching where you say, whatever happens, there is no force majeure. 5 crores comes today, 5 crores comes after 12 months, doesn't matter. Under any circumstance. That's clean tranching. Sometimes the tranching can be 5 crores comes now, 5 crores comes in if you hit some milestones. So that's again a structuring. It is something that the person is trying to structure.
In short, if there is somebody who wants to discuss the term sheet with the investor, you have to have a good lawyer along with him sitting across the table.
I would say yes. I think you should definitely have a good advisor with you. It could be a lawyer, it could be an investment banker. Because investment banker may know some of the practical realities as well, right? Versus a lawyer, depending upon whether the lawyer has experience in investments or the lawyer does not have the experience. So I think that's the difference. So you should pick a lawyer. If you're picking a lawyer, pick a lawyer who's had experience in doing investments and doing transactions. But definitely, I say this again and again, hire a very high quality advisor or an investment banker. Make the effort in getting one, building a good relationship, and don't pinch pennies for getting a good advisor. A bad advisor or someone whom जिनको आँखों की शर्म नहीं होती, as I say, which in a very, I don't know whether you're familiar with, there's a notion of sense of decency, so that even after the transaction is over, you want to have a cup of tea or coffee with them. You need a good quality advisor on your side. Pay for it, and don't cringe on it. Similarly, lawyer, get a good lawyer on your side. Don't cringe on it. These are the mistakes that we have seen early entrepreneurs make, which tomorrow we can unravel some of these things, but it's very complicated. See, because a good eventual investor is someone who cares for you. So therefore, no investor, and I can tell you, Sequoia Capital has never made money because of terms of return. Okay, so any sensible, half-decent investor knows you can never make money on terms. You only make money when the company does well, and the entrepreneur is building the company. So that's the eventual reality, right? But along the way, you may meet, everyone may not have this perspective, right? And therefore, it's important to protect yourself. So don't cringe on lawyer fees and don't cringe on investment banking fees early on in life. It's a terrible tragedy when that happens, and it's very deeply upsetting. And I still meet, last week I met someone who's built a 100 crore company and has cringed on the kind of quality of advice that the person is getting. He is getting absolutely the wrong advice. I can tell you. I said that much to the entrepreneur, and therefore the advisor who was advising him has stopped, interacting with me after that meeting. But it is terrible. It is terrible. So even big companies make, so-called big companies, 100 crores is not very big in the Indian context. But even those companies make that. But that's just a very broad philosophical point, nothing to do with the term sheet. But just, if there's one thing that I'd like you to do is to have good quality people on your side when you're negotiating this and pay them well.
What is this?
I know it's a terrible, I shouldn't be saying this.
What do you usually pay a merchant in the merchant banker?
Sorry?
What do you usually pay a merchant banker?
So I would say if you want a good quality merchant banker, especially if I'm not a merchant banker, so I'm just saying based on what I do. So I would say if you want a good quality merchant banker for the first Series A investment, I would say 50 to 75 lakhs. Otherwise, it's typically not percentage because the amount of capital you're raising will be very small. But I would say good quality people will cost you 50, 75 lakhs. If you want good quality lawyers on your side negotiating a deal, it's probably 15, 20 lakhs. So India is one of the fortunate countries where at least on the lawyer side, they don't cost that much to get good lawyers actually. But people, compromise. They want the 2 lakh guy, 3 lakh guy. It's like compromising on accountants. It never helps a company. So good lawyers, 10, 15, 20, you get the best lawyers in town. And I would say good investment banker, at least 50, 60 lakhs. So that there's enough, you should feel motivated about doing the right things.
For larger deals?
Look, in India, historically proportions are 1.5 to 2.5% of the size of the transaction. But it's the lowest in the world. Lowest in the world. Most other parts of the world is between 5 and 7%. So we have a plentiful supply of advisors. That's a very tough market. But the good news is therefore it's not that, it feels expensive, but it's not that expensive. Yeah.
I have a question. You spoke about deploying capital in tranches. Does that correlate to valuation? So,
sure. So investing capital, yes, we do tranche. It could be related to valuation also. It could also be something where you say the first tranche comes in now at this valuation, and second tranche comes in at this valuation.
you don't get all the money at one time.
Exactly. That's one of the reasons why I think some of the entrepreneurs opt for tranche because they say, I don't need all the money now, so I'll take this much money now. I'll take this much
You don't
money
have to
now.
raise money later from somewhere else.
Exactly. But I personally, again, I have a very conservative view on these things. So there are people who will ask you to take more risks. But even though I'm an investor at the early stage, on these things I'm really conservative. So tranching, for example, simple tranching, unambiguous, linked to nothing. That's what I would ask for, and that's usually sets the right tone. The moment you link the tranche to some event, performance, you're unnecessarily putting yourself up. Look at what you're doing. You're saying, I'll take 2 million now, I'll take 2 million later if I do this. You're normally doing this is something good, right? It's very ironic. When the company is not done well, and probably needs the money, you won't get the money. But it's amazing how often you see people signing up for tranches based on performance. I would never sign a tranche based on performance. You should insist on unambiguous tranche. Unambiguous tranche is good for everyone. It's good for you because you're raising the capital you need. It's good for the investor because that much investment is not blocked. It's basically money coming in after once, and it improves an IR and stuff like that. That's not really the reason. From an investor perspective, it's like X amount of capital is gone, and more capital will go into the company. It's just become a little older. That's all.
What does this mean about different terms, primary and secondary?
Oh yes. So primary is when money is going into the company. Secondary is when money is going to other shareholders or to the entrepreneur. So you may sell 5% of your company, right, along with a part of the investment. So you may say, I need so much money, and remaining is secondary. And then people do that in not early stages, but as you become a slightly larger, as you become a larger company, as you build the company for 3 to 4 years, most of you are building company with all the sweat, passion, and frugal. You're not paying yourselves big salaries. So very often after 3 or 4 or 5 years, an entrepreneur may say, you know what, I want to buy a nice house. So can you give me $1 million of liquidity? That's a second. And we do that.
Will you stay diluted in tranches, or is it diluted all in one?
In tranches. So dilution happens when money comes into the company. That's the only time dilution can happen.
You said merchant banking is 50 to 75 lakhs. Would that be on the lines of what you would get from a Goldman Sachs usually?
No, you will not. But, you will get good quality advisors. Look, I'm not even sure you should go. I don't know that you can go to this sitting here, but you should go to someone who will give you a little bit of attention, right? I think the challenge for someone like Goldman or big guys is that they're interested in larger fee pockets. But what I say 50-35 is a good, solid regional banker, someone strong in a Bombay or a Chennai or a Bangalore who will give you good quality.
Not an
advice.
MNC.
No, not an MNC. I think some of those guys are, the teams are too thin, you know. They have like, some of these big guys now in India have 8 people and 12 people and 16 bankers. So they are chasing ONGC and they want to do that IPO and all that stuff. I think there are a lot of good advisors you will get for this. And you know, I can just drop me an email, I can recommend you a few. Seriously, I can. We work with some good ones. So I want to say, because you know, we have a company where we just got a guy for 50 to 75 lakhs, and I think he's done a terrific job for us for one of our portfolio companies. So I think, yeah.
You said you raise funds in the lifespan of 7 to 8 years to repay your investment. And because of that, there is a piece of 5 years of exit. Can you roll over your investments to the next fund?
So two things, 7-8 is normal, not Sequoia. I think we raise our fund at 12 years. So it is the longest in the market, and you will see. Usually funds are 7 to 8 years. Our funds are the longest 12 years. No, normally we don't encourage rollovers from one fund to another fund, because that's why it's cheating, you know.
Then you can use the drag along.
That's not fair. No, it doesn't help, because drag along still means that you can't transfer ownership. So the whole objective of our investors is they have invested, and most of our investors are charities, education endowments, and trusts. So they are looking for this capital because they want to do a lot of good work, the Ford Foundation, and we have like a bunch of children's hospitals. They're interested in money coming back so that they can invest in what they're doing. So they're not looking for ownership. And rolling over is bad practice, which I just like. Theoretically, yes, that's what the sovereign guys say. I don't know. I'm not, you know, we've worked with a few of them. Yeah. Practically speaking.
They're more lifetime capital.
Yes, you know, but then, you know, I'm just joking. Please don't take me wrong. You know, I actually have GICs and co-investments on my portfolio. But look, you know, Honda was up and it's fair, right? I'm saying it's, the reality you must recognize is that investors in some of these ultimately are rewarded on the back of how well the returns come. And those returns are on the back of real returns, not on the back of paper returns. So therefore, there is always a motivation if something is going well in 5, 7, 8 years to eventually sell, because only then you can show performance. So I wouldn't buy that argument. I don't agree with that.
Suppose the fund is like for 10 years, and that you are raising money, that money is already in the 8th year. Does it have any implication because the life is only for remaining 3 years?
So the great question. But first, I want to know how much time do I have, and I can continue.
Yeah, you can.
There's no next constraint.
There is one more speaker, but
Okay.
15 minutes.
Okay, because I don't know what time it is.
So it's 5 o'clock. What we're looking at is we want to break for 15 minutes, I'm sure, right? Everybody wants to have some cup of tea or coffee. So 5:50 we were looking at breaking for tea, coffee. And then 5:30 we'll have the next session, which is all about case studies.
Perfect. So yeah, so I'll go on and you just tell me when you want to stop for me. I just want to know whether I had any other slide after this, but I think that's fine. Is there something useful? Diligence, what people do? Yes. So I'll just cover this, but your question I'll answer. I think most good quality firms, you know, will try, while we say, let's say Sequoia Capital, they have a 12-year fund. Normally what we like to do is we would like to invest the fund we raise within 3 to 4 years. Okay. And normally we will go back into the market and raise capital at the end of 3 to 4 years. Because we don't want to be stuck in a situation which you're saying, which is investing out of a fund which is in its 8th year, and then we're telling the entrepreneur, you know what, I'm really sorry, but you know my fund life is ended. So that's complete crap. If some investor comes and tells you that, you know, you need to sign an exit clause for 3 years because my fund life is going away, be careful. Be careful, because it may be true, it may be because that genuinely they're investing out of a very old fund. But be careful or thoughtful there. You should insist on raising capital from a fund that is the soonest, which makes sense. And most funds, of course you can ask. And in fact, you know that also, because during the documentation, they will tell you which fund it is being invested out of. And as a part of the legal documentation, they will disclose saying, you know, for example, we say Sequoia Capital India 4, I think is the fund, which we raised in April of this year. That's the fund from which we are investing. So it's disclosed. And normally we try to invest within 3 years. Normally 3 to 4 years, because so that we have the, at least even the company we invest right in the end has 7 years. Yes.
Is the entrepreneur or the ESOP pool's salary linked to the shares that the entrepreneur holds, or are they two different?
Two very different things. The ESOP pool is linked to how much equity are you creating for potential employees you will need. Now, that number can vary. For example, if let's say it's a founding team of 3 guys. One guy is sales, one guy is product, one guy is, someone who's operations. So there's a good chance, and the founders get along well, and it's very clear that all 3 of them are very good and very enthusiastic. There's a good chance that the number of professionals you're likely to need to build the company will be a smaller number. Then you may say, you know what, I'm comfortable with a 5% ESOP pool or a 10% ESOP pool for employees. But if, for example, it's just you, and basically it's very clear that there will need to be a team over a period of time, then the ESOP pool will be much larger. Now, ESOP pools in India, I actually think is a problem, so I'm happy to tell you guys, because I think ESOP pools in India are much lesser than what they need to be. In the US, for example, it's usually, they almost call it the 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 rule. There is a single founder, 1/3 for the founder, 1/3 investment, equity for the investment coming in, 1/3 is kept for employee ESOP. It is unbelievable. I think that's probably one of the reasons they succeed and so much of success happens, because they're just able to get very good quality talent lined up. Compared to that, I think Indian entrepreneurs are much more stingy. Even Indian investors, I think, are stingy. I would rarely see any ESOP pool 10%, maybe 15%. There's one very special case, a completely unusual case, which was my term sheet, detailed term sheet, and if you have a chance, we'll go through it, is an entrepreneur who had actually given away 12% for 3 other people while even starting the company, much before he took the first investment. I think it's remarkable. It speaks very well.
Before he raised any money.
Before he raised any money. Can you imagine? 89. So when I looked at the term sheet of this guy, gentleman, I was shocked. I said, why 89%? Where is the remaining 11%? And that's from 3-4 employees who have joined. And there's no investor. He got them between, this is a company that was founded in 2007. And he's built it between 2007 and 2011. And he's given it. Phenomenal.
So these vest in some stages?
Yes, normally you vest over 4 years, 5 years, if it's employees. Vested over a period of time. If it's very early, founders also, actually even founder shareholding vests. And there's a reason for that. Normally if it's a single founder, it's less of an issue. But if there are 3 founders, for example, you will see sometimes some investors, and we have done that, where even the founder shares vest over 3 or 4 years. Because look, you've teamed up with 3 people, it's great going, but you just don't know how many people are going to last out the struggle that's going to be there. Right? Some people do and some people don't. So then what happens is, if you're left with, let's say the 3 founders, they start with 33% come what may, it's possible for one guy after 1 year to say, you know what, I raised my hand, I'm going for a job. And then what happens? One, you have 2 other founders who have lower ownership, and then you have this large, big, what we would call very harshly as dead equity. Because it's almost like basically the third of the company with the guy who's not interested in the company anymore. So even founders, if there are multiple founders, normally it's good practice, even for you, to insist on it being vested over 3 or 4 years when a new investor comes in. Because then you know that the only founders who are going to have the entire shares that they owe is people who last for 3 years or 4 years.
So the founders themselves take it up as good practice that we will invest in ourselves
I think
over
so.
a period of time.
I think so. In fact, I think even if there is no Series A conversation, you're teaming up with 4 guys, I would urge you to vest it over 3 or 4 years. I just think it makes sense because this journey is a journey with lots of ups and downs. Some people don't last it. So,
secondary thing is that traction.
yes.
So the founders have already not taken anything to sustain the company and bring it up 3 to 4 years. They have not taken any salaries or anything. It's still at the pre-revenue stage. A lot of capital, some founders' capital has been put in. So when they are getting the first level of funding, can they take a part of it for their...
So theoretically, yes. Practically speaking, it creates lots of nervousness. A new investor coming in, if in the first Series A.
Year and a half.
No, I would not say that. I would say wait for Series B before you start thinking about personal liquidity. What you can do is, I think when a Series A happens, is you can have conversations on compensation, especially if you've undercompensated yourself, very significantly in the first 3-4 years. You can ask for a fair compensation or a below the market compensation. Usually works very well.
So that is defined in the term sheet then?
Not really. Compensation depends. I don't think so. Normally it should be a part of maybe legal documentation, but frankly it should be a board matter which should get discussed. I don't even think, because that's something that will keep changing, right? I'm saying they change it at the end of the first year, second. I wouldn't put it in the term sheet because term sheets are legal documents that last forever. So I wouldn't.
In most of the Indian cases where you have taken a debt, the post-investment of the debt comes as an unsecured loan from the bank themselves. case that I'm going for an investment from a venture capital, how does this unsecured debt or whatever, I am saying that let's create a ESOP fund now. So do the investors allow the creation of ESOP fund, one to support, one to refund the unsecured loan, and second to protect the...
So I think your investors will look very nervously if you're thinking of it as a loan. Okay, I think the right answer is the expectation would be that it is coming as equity, and therefore it will get treated as equity.
On the balance sheet it will be shown as an unsecured loan.
I know, but I think before investments normally they would insist on the unsecured loan getting converted to equity.
So
To equity.
either or it will be getting into
Have only people who are truly interested in building a large company in the cap table eventually.
No, but my friend has a job. He's saying that would debt not be a failure capable? Meaning that.
Debt, you're saying?
Yeah. As an unsecured loan that the point.
Yeah, but the last thing you want is, let's say I'm investing 15 crores, and if you're going to say 1 crore or other is going to go out of the company, you're like, really? It's a young company, it means every money. That's the way you think about it. The last thing you want to be doing is to reduce the amount that's coming into the company. That's the way most people will do it. So don't do it in Series A. It just sends a lot of unnecessary red flag, which actually you may not intend at all. You may have thought through lots of things, but doesn't intend it. Series B, Series C will get cleaned up. Don't worry. So I'm going to just spend 2 minutes on this. I think this is the last page. Yes, this is okay. This is not so bad. Look, I think this is after term sheet signing. What kind of stuff does an investor do? I think on the business side, they will already ask the question on business. They normally should be well informed, know from your interactions. They may do some more work on the business side. I think on the finance side, there will be some conversation. If it's a super early company, then there are no financials. It's really more of the metrics and trajectory. This is almost like, think of it as checking whether what you represented to them was roughly close to reality. And that's probably the way to think about the financial diligence. Similarly, compliance, sometimes in early companies there may be some compliance elements like what you just said, which is any old, you may not have had board meetings, obviously, you may not have had many things that are supposed to be done according to companies law in India. So there will be some regulatory cleanup if required that will be done. There will be background check. So this is something that you must know and be aware of. I'd be shocked if you already don't know. Most investors will do reference calls, will find out history. And therefore, one thing I always say is that, look, all our lives are roller coasters. There are always ups and downs. Just be super upfront with investors early on. Because what you don't want is to find something about the entrepreneur which he's not told you before. For whatever reason. It could be anything. It could be a personal default on a credit card. It could be anything. Disclose this because one thing that's happened in India is pretty much everything now is trackable. Especially on financial side, even other sides. So you will see reference calls, you will see people checking testimonials, personal litigation. Yes, if there is any, it will be helpful to know. So just disclose that. Tax, may not be relevant for a small company, but may be relevant for a larger company. I think this is basically it. I think I think this is not. This is it. So that's really the summary. Now we have 5 minutes.
Yes, yes.
So it doesn't make sense to open up that sheet. So just any other questions? I can deal with other questions now before.
Okay. The document you don't want to do.
Can you show that sheet?
Can you show it to them?
It's open.
Let him.
I'll just show you. This one? It's like I thought clean up is required because I have. How do I go down?
And now?
Thank you. You can open that. Let's just go down. I think maybe I can cover some of the things which. So, yeah, this is your investment amount. How much amount is invested? What valuation? This was a structured deal in the sense it was tranched. There was X amount of money going in the first year and X amount going in the second year. Clean, simple tranche, purely based on time. Just go down. Let me think about what else is there. Board of directors, we spoke about affirmative rights. Let's just spend 1 minute on that because these are the kind of stuff you will see on the affirmative right. Altering the capital structure of the company, which is raise more equity, raise more debt, etc. Any amendment to the company's chart documents. I'm sure many of you have opened a company, you'll have ROC, you'll have filed articles of association, you'll have said this is what the company will do, so any amendment on that. Any change in business, any big acquisition, any creation of ESOP pool, M&A, JV, change in terms of employment of key founders, key people. Please go down. Yeah, material amendment or variations from annual budget, related body transactions, accounting practice changes, appointment of auditors. So, look, these are affirmative. These are really, they all determine the life of the company. They're big things that change the way, change the life of a company. So, this is what you should expect in an affirmative rights. Anything silly, too operational, I think it gives you something, it tells you something about the investor, is all I'd say. Go down. Yeah, so this is anti-dilution. It's usually a very simple, it's called full ratchet anti-dilution is what the technical legal word for this is, but broadly it does, what we spoke about, which is if there is a round happening at a lower price, your valuation gets reset. So that everyone's on the same side of the table. Lick pref, this was an example of a simple straight 1x lick pref. You will see key man exclusivity, the fact that you spend all your time on this enterprise alone. Investors are very nervous with entrepreneurs having multiple entities where you're investing only in one entity. And we always say that to all our entrepreneurs. We want to be joined at the hip, which means it's like if it works, it's great. If it doesn't work, we all go down. So big nervousness around this. Pro rata right we spoke about. Exit right, I think we spoke about it broadly. 3 levels. There'll be an IPO. If IPO can't happen, find another investor. If you can't find another investor, then a drag. In this case, there was no drag because this is a company that's 200 crores of revenue. So there's no need for a drag. It's very clear that this company will eventually grow up and liquidity should not be a problem. There will be some tag along I spoke about. Let's go to, I don't think, I think we can talk about none of them are super material. You will see something called warranties, and these are all legal stuff. Fees, exclusivity, and so on. Exclusivity is important because basically you're signing up for saying, in a term sheet, actually that's important material because you will be signing up exclusivity with investors. Because investors are going to say, you know what, after the term sheet, if you agree, I'm going to do a bunch of work. Legal diligence, business diligence, and I'm going to invest time in doing it and money in doing it. So one of the expectations most investors will have is some form of exclusivity. Now the exclusivity will be for 45 days, 30 days, 60 days, depending upon how much history is there in the company and how big the company is. But that's something that you should, it's not a big deal, but look, in a very hot market, it might feel like a big deal signing up for exclusivity for a long period of time. But it is normal practice, it's very normal practice. Most of the governing law, will be India. I don't think most investors will insist on it. There's some investors who insist on outside of India, but please don't agree to that. It's too expensive. Sign up for India litigation if eventually there is any type of litigation.
Why is the fees there? 15 lakhs?
Yeah. So the way it works is normally there is a diligence cost basically that is done. Now this is a larger company and therefore it's going to cost so much money to do diligence, right? And sometimes the cost of diligence on part of the investor can be 75 lakhs, sometimes it can be 1 crore, sometimes it can be 30 lakhs, right? So normally what you will see is, the typical expectation is that half the fee is shared by the company if the investment happens. Of course, if the investment doesn't happen, the full fees are borne by the investor. But if the investment happens, then typically that's the expectation. So for a very young company, the number may be 15, 20 lakhs, is what they would expect you to put in, because that's what it will cost. It will cost at least 30, 40 lakhs for the diligences, etc. to happen. So roughly half the number is what people expect the company to take care of, if the investment happens.
Yeah, what is typically for how much of investment?
15, 20 or 50?
15 to 20 lakhs.
Yeah, that's for a small investment. So I would say if the investment is between 10 crores to 20 crores, that's the number I would put. The number is usually higher, 40 lakhs if it's like, in this case, it's a 100 crore investment. So it will cost them.
What if the promoter is confident about his company and he wants to claw back his share, wants to claw back the equity that he has contributed to the venture capital? How does it go about it?
So normally it's not something, so how will you claw back?
Question is like, suppose can you exactly have an arrangement where there is a 5% every month, every 1 year or 2 years, and ready to purchase back to equity from you at
How will you purchase back? What resources will you have to purchase back? So therefore you will not sign up for it. No investor will sign up for it, because therefore the expectation should be, look, the person is taking equity risk to take equity type returns. So you don't want to claw back. You don't want to sell at fair market value. You don't want to get, those are not the things that, if an investor, serious investor investing in a company wants to take a big return, which means you want to take the risk so there will be big upside. So the moment you try to cap upside by just saying more than 25% IRR, more than X, I want to be able to buy back this at fair market value. These are all red flags for the equity investor.
This wasn't there for that.
Yes, that was based on performance. So basically this one, just go up, there was a clawback where the entrepreneur would get back 1% if we made more than 4 times the return. So just go back, I think right in the first page there would be a clawback. There will be a small clawback. Yeah. So here, if you go back, just go back. Yeah. Just go back, I want to give you the context for the clawback. So if you notice here, basically the investment of we were doing some secondary as well, and primary, the secondary was happening at a lower price than the primary, and that delta was basically around 1%. And therefore, there was an option for the entrepreneur to claw back the 1%. So he doesn't pay anything for it. This is like 1% clawback that happens, which effectively values the secondary as much as the primary if we made 4, if Sequoia and fund made more than 4 times.
Is there any preference for investment, private equity investment company which is not listed in India? Suppose I have a vision to be operating in 2 or 3 geographies. Does it make sense for me to have separate entities in these geographies, or say suppose it's India, Singapore, and say Thailand? Should I have a company that's just a holding company based out of Singapore that then?
I think so. It's a good idea. It's a good practice if you think, especially if there's a real business out of India. I think it makes sense for you to be operating out of Singapore, for example. It's also a very friendly country. It's very easy to operate, to set up, but it's also expensive. And these are some startup costs associated with it.
You would think that you run these as separate entities because they would have separate
See, an investor would want to invest in one entity on the top, which covers all the entities. So the question is, should that entity be based out of Singapore? The answer is preferably yes, probably yes. There could be some value to it. Especially if it is IP related, depending on the nature of the company. If it's an IP related business with not much investment, not much business in India, but a lot of the business coming out, it's not a bad idea to headquarter such an opportunity out of Singapore. It's not a bad idea. Yeah, no, I think unless someone has saw something which they'd like to build. Perfect. Anything else? Great. Thank you so much. Yes. Oh yes, I will write my name down.